Many Chicago Bears fans hope that 2015 was the start of a new era, a new beginning for the Chicago Bears organization under new general manager Ryan Pace and head coach John Fox. And when you look at how the 2015 season played out, I don't think anybody should be surprised. There were games where this team kept it close. There were games where this team was competitive. There were games where this team played above themselves and won some games that maybe they shouldn't have. But then on the flip side, they had games that they maybe should have won, but they did not win, which is an indication of a not very good football team. And then they had other games where they were never in it, especially when you look at the way they started the season, that brutal stretch to kick off the year with Green Bay, Arizona, and Seattle. So when all comes to pass, the Bears end up finishing in last in the NFC North. And again, I don't think that was a massive surprise. 6-10 record. I thought this was a team that would win 4, maybe 5 games. 6 would be pushing it. They pushed it this year, and they got to 6-10. And now they head into the offseason with the number 11 overall pick in the 2016 NFL Draft. And there was progress to be made. The fact is this is an organization that I've talked about for years, needs a full and total complete rebuild. This fantasy land that some Bears fans have lived in the past few years, that this team was this close, or if they got this break or that break, they were a playoff team or a serious contender. They were just fooling themselves. They were living in a fan-filled fantasy land, and that's the truth of the matter. And I've been proven to be right over the past few years. Now, when I look at this, it's kind of hard because on the one hand, I don't want to see my team lose every single game. But I also know that there's something to be said about just being mediocre and not being terrible doesn't do a lot of long-term good potentially for your organization either. And the Bears were perfectly positioned here in 2015 to me to, dare I say, tank it. Get the best possible draft pick they could, and then that's when the rebuild really kicks into high gear. Now, obviously, that's not the most favorable talk when you're talking about within that organization. A lot of fans don't like that talk and don't feel that it's very family to think that way, and I understand that. But again, for years I've been taking a long-term view and approach when it comes to the outlook of the Chicago Bears organization. And at some point in time, if you're going to be bad, you have to go all the way, because otherwise you're just kind of wasting time and you're playing grab ass. And like I've talked about with the Bears for years, you get closer than you really are, and you think you're better than you really are. So it creates unrealistic expectations that ultimately aren't going to be fulfilled. So to me, the best possible result for this team in 2015 would have been to end up with the top 3 pick in this draft. That's just me. But they're still picking at 11. They could still do some damage there. But there were some other things in general that I did like about this year, things that went well. I think you've got to look first at their 2015 draft class. This was Ryan Pace's first chance to run his own war room. This was his scouting department, his front office's first chance to kind of make an impression here and to positively affect the Bears organization long term. And I thought they did a really good job of that. Second round pick Eddie Goldman showed that he could be a long-term answer inside at nose tackle for this 3-4 Bears defense. You look at 4th round pick Jeremy Langford. He's got people now, based off of what he showed in his rookie year, thinking that Matt Forte might be done as a Chicago Bear. People are actually eager to move on from Matt Forte, which is a surprising sentiment to me to a certain degree. 5th round pick Adrian Amos played like the day 2 prospect he probably was. So you've got a few what look like long-term starters there. Hronis Grasu, the 3rd round pick, he had a kind of up and down rookie year, but there's some reason for hope. There's some potential there. So you're looking at potentially 4 long-term starters for this Bears organization out of one draft. And oh, by the way, I didn't even mention their 1st round pick, Kevin White, who I still think will be a really, really good player at the NFL level. He was shut down for the entire season with his shin injury. So you basically had a 1st round pick with a redshirt year. Now you come into 2016, you had those 4 guys that got a lot of opportunity in Amos, Langford, Grasu, and Goldman. Now imagine what you have when you have a Kevin White coming back into the fold. It would be like you had 2 marquee 1st-round picks as rookies in 2016. It was a really good initial draft class for that Chicago Bears organization. And then you got to look at the performance of Jay Cutler. Now look, let's not get crazy here. Jay Cutler did not have a great, phenomenal season. And the people saying that he did are crazy. And they didn't watch the games, or they didn't watch the games in the right way. Cutler played better this year. Was he great? Oh, God, no. Did he still have those moments of Cutlerism? Yes, he did. He just didn't have them as often and as frequently. And part of the things that did go wrong for Jay Cutler throughout the course of the year aren't necessarily something you could directly attribute to him. He's somebody that was without his number one wide receiver, Alshon Jeffrey, for almost half the year. The first round pick, Kevin White, at wide receiver, he didn't have him all year. Martellus Bennett had kind of an up and down year until he got hurt late, and he was out the rest of the year. He lost Matt Forte for a few games. Yes, Jeremy Langford stepped in, but no offense to Jeremy Langford, he's not Matt Forte. And you had problems on the offensive line. Cutler did a decent job. Now, part of that, granted, was kind of the reserve philosophy on offense of the Chicago Bears team. They basically tried to take it out of Cutler's hands as much as they possibly could. They tried to play it close to the vest. But in general, Cutler did okay. Not okay enough for me to want him to stick around another 3-4 years. That's ridiculous. But he was okay. So you haven't heard me rant and rave too much about Jay Cutler this year because it's almost to the point now after 7 years. I've said what's needed to be said. I've been right about what's needed to be said. And at this point in time, the reality is just what the reality is, so I continue to rally against it. I will look at the free agent signing of Pernell McPhee. It was a move, honestly, that I was kind of so-so about. I could see it, but then I was like, Pernell McPhee, when he played this year, played to me at a Pro Bowl, almost all-pro level. I mean, he was really, really good. That was a very good initial offering into the free agent market for general manager Ryan Pace and head coach John Fox, getting somebody like a Pernell McPhee because he played very, very well when given the opportunity. This was a team that went 5-3 on the road. You only won 6 games, but you went 5-3 on the road. Good teams win games on the road. And the Bears won games on the road this year, 5-3. That's something to hang your hat on. This was a team that was 6th in the league in offensive time of possession. That means they were effective moving the football. They didn't turn the ball over as much as they have in years past. At times they were able to sustain long drives, and keep their defense off the field, which in part led to some of the defensive improvements that we saw on that side of the ball. Now, obviously, defensive coordinator Vic Fangio and head coach John Fox had something to do with that as well. No question that the defensive X's and O's improved exponentially in 2015, but part of it also ties into that offensive philosophy of controlling the clock, taking care of the football, and keeping the defense off the field. But you look at this defense, I mean, they were middle of the road as a unit. And the crazy thing about that is it feels like such a huge improvement. Yeah, their defense still had bad games, but in general, you felt like you were actually watching an NFL defense. And based off of the past couple of years, what we saw under former defensive coordinator Mel Tucker, that's a big, big damn improvement. And perhaps the biggest thing that went well this year, John Fox's first year in Chicago, you're trying to change the culture, you're trying to establish your way, and you beat Green Bay on Thanksgiving night in prime time. You beat Green Bay. I've seen that happen far too infrequently over the past decade plus, actually, throughout the course of the past 2+ decades. The Bears beat the Green Bay Packers. For a Bears fan that's looking for something to hang their hat on in 2015, there you freaking go. John Fox, in his first year at the helm, beat the Green Bay Packers. Yippee. Now, like I said, there are reasons for hope, reason for optimism, reason to be excited about some of the things you saw in 2015 and what they could potentially mean for this team long term. However, with that said, there were a lot of things that didn't go well, as you would expect with a team that finished 6-10 and has one of the least talented rosters on both sides of the ball, in my opinion, in all of the National Football League. First problem they had was health. When you look at this team, they're already lacking in star power and impact players. They're lacking in depth. So now you start to suffer a bunch of injuries to a bunch of key guys. That's only going to expose those depth problems even more. I mean, you look at the guys that were playing in the secondary, guys that played well at moments like Bryce Callahan and Harold Jones-Quartry. Easy for me to say. But at the end of the day, the fact that you even had to go to those guys indicates the problems with the depth of the defense. And then offensively, when Alshon Jeffrey's out and you've traded away Brandon Marshall and then Marquise Wilson, Eddie Royal are missing time, you're going at wide receiver with guys like Mark Mariani and Josh Bellamy. Sorry, that isn't good. And we know it. So the fact this team wasn't able to stay healthy only further impacted their abilities throughout the course of the year to be competitive, to be productive, because they didn't have a lot on the back burner. One thing that really disappointed me about this team was they were 1-5 in the NFC North. Yeah, it's great that they got that win against Green Bay on Thanksgiving night, because otherwise they would have been skunked in the division. They lost twice to Minnesota, and even worse, they lost twice to Detroit. The fact they couldn't even beat Detroit one time, I think, is unacceptable. It's unacceptable. Because at the end of the day, your biggest guarantee of making the playoffs is what? Winning your division. And for a guy like John Fox, they should have been better than 1-5 in the NFC North. And you can argue if Green Bay didn't play one of their 2 or 3 worst games of the entire season, the Bears wouldn't have beat Green Bay. They'd have finished 5-11, and they would have went 0-6 in the NFC North. That can't happen. But what's even worse is the fact that this team went 1-7 at home. If you're someday going to become a playoff team, you have to be able to handle your business at home. But for some reason, this team did well on the road, but they're losing games at home to teams like the San Francisco 49ers. That just can't happen. 1-7 at home is embarrassing. And that must improve starting in 2016. If you're only going to win 6 games again, then you best damn make sure that 4 or 5 of them come at home. Because otherwise, no teams are going to fear coming into Soldier Field, and you don't want that. That has to change. Now, offensively, this is still a team that lacked explosiveness, lacked consistent big plays. Yes, they held onto the ball a lot in terms of time of possession. They finished 23rd in the league in points allowed or points scored, 23rd in the league in passing yards. Their offensive philosophy, and people will talk about Adam Gase and what he did with Jay Cutler. And there's something to be said about that. But part of it is, too, is that they played such a conservative nature on the offensive side of the ball. It was almost like a chicken shit mentality. I point to the Seattle game as a big disappointment to me because it's one thing to know you're probably going to get beat, but it's another thing to play as if you know you're going to get beat and you're going to accept it from the beginning. Yes, you had Jimmy Clausen, but for Christ's sakes, you didn't even try. It's like you were literally just trying to punt the ball. You were scared. And late in that game in the 4th quarter, you're down 26-0 and you're punting the ball. Get the fuck out of here. This team has to open it up a little bit going forward. I understand part of that conservative nature helped Jay Cutler not have such a bad year. But at the end of the day, if you're going to play it that close to the vest and that conservative, that consistently on offense, you're only going to get so far, even if you're a much more talented team. Which, again, has been a big knock on John Fox and his philosophy over the years. And that he's far too conservative, plays it far too close to the vest. And when you need to take big risks and you need to take chances, he just won't do it. And his teams suffer as a result. And then you look at, in terms of, we talk about team health. Your first-round pick, Kevin White, missed the entire year. Alshon Jeffrey played a little over half the season. Free agent signing Antrell Roll played less than half the season. Eddie Royal didn't play much, and when he did, he flat out sucked. This was a team that had 4 games where they allowed 30 or more points. So defensively, they still had those moments where they were very bad. And then they also had 4 games on offense where they scored less than 20, or 4 games, where they allowed 24 to 29 points. So half of their games are allowing teams 24 plus points. So that playing it close to the vest, conservative nature on offense isn't doing you any justice. It's really putting you behind the 8 ball, limiting your overall offensive possessions, and meaning you have to maximize and strike often when you do have the ball. Because you're inflicting your own wounds in some ways, especially because, again, even though there were defensive improvements, there were times where this defense still gave up a lot of points. And especially when you look at the fact that there were only 3 games that the Bears this year scored 24-plus points. So think about that. 8 games where they allowed 24-plus points total, but only 3 games that they scored that many points. Hard to figure out why this team ended up going 6-10. And then you look at the coaching staff, and you look at the hiring of Adam Gase. One of my concerns about this hiring of Adam Gase was that people talked about him being the offensive coordinator in Denver with Peyton Manning, but that's ridiculous, and everybody should know that by now. The offensive coordinator in Denver or anywhere Peyton Manning plays is Peyton Manning. So now you bring Adam Gase into Chicago, knowing that he was a hot head coaching prospect, knowing there's a very good chance that he's only going to work with Jay Cutler for 1 year, and then he's going to be out the door and a head coach somewhere else, and then you're starting right back over, and you've given Jay Cutler yet another offensive coordinator to work with. This organization and their inconsistency in terms of the offensive coordinators they have working with Jay Cutler and how many have they gone through him over the years. For all the knocks I have against Jay Cutler, and all of them true, he's had to work with far too many guys, far too many systems. It's just not productive. It's just not healthy for him in his development over the years. And you've seen that. A guy that when he resort back to the physical skills, he's maddeningly inconsistent. He's athletic, but he doesn't show it enough. He's got big-time arm strength, but again, doesn't show that enough. There are times he can make gorgeous throws, but there's times that he can't throw the ball 5 yards in front of him and hit the guy. A guy that still has a tendency to stare down his primary target too often. I mean, this guy is always resorting back to his physical traits because the mental part of the game for Cutler over the years has been stunted as a part of the Chicago Bears organization because they keep changing the coordinators every damn year or two. And now you're doing it again. So what was the point of bringing in Adam Gase and getting some improvement out of Jay Cutler in 2015 just to say, hey, now we got to promote Lowell Doggins? It's not the same. Even if they keep the similar philosophy, it's not the exact same. I just don't get it. So in terms of organizational priorities this offseason, first and foremost, they got to figure out what they're going to do with Jay Cutler. He's a guy that if they decide to keep him, they're going to lock themselves into a lot of guaranteed money for him for 2016. And my fear is that this team thinks that they saw enough out of Jay Cutler that they feel like they can win big with him at some point down the road. And that's just foolish. And if that's the philosophy and thinking of Ryan Pace and John Fox, then they need to be fired. And I'm not saying that lightly, and I'm not trying to overstate it or just be sensational here, but the simple fact of the matter is, if your general manager and your head coach think that Jay Cutler's a guy that could get you to the promised land, then that speaks to their lack of football intelligence and understanding of the greater situation, and as a result, they both need to go. Now, I don't think that that's a smart move at this point, but at this point in time, they got to decide what they're going to do with Jay Cutler. Maybe you just let him play it out in 2016 as you bring in a young quarterback and you give him a year to learn behind Cutler. And maybe that will be an impetus for Cutler to play even better, is finally to have some legitimate competition at the position. And have to be looking over his shoulder. All these years, one thing that's always concerned me about this Bears organization, they've refused to address the quarterback position behind him in terms of young talent or a potential future guy. And it makes you wonder about the mental strength of Jay Cutler. If he can't handle the competition, then get the fuck out of there. I'd expect ultimately that Ryan Pace and John Fox fell in love with what they saw in Cutler, and they're going to keep him around another fucking year at least, and probably longer. Oh, God. But then there's even other important decisions that have to be made. The contract situations for Alshon Jeffrey and Matt Forte. In terms of Alshon Jeffrey, I'd like to see him back in 2016, but I think the wise move would be to franchise him. I don't think giving him a long-term deal at this point is a wise move. You gave him the chance in 2015 to show what he could do as a number one wide receiver. He had some really good games, but just like Alshon Jeffrey does, he has other games where he completely disappears and is a non-factor, and he missed almost half the season to injuries, similar to what he did in his rookie year. Do you really want to pay him top 5 or top 10 in the league wide receiver money if he's only potentially going to play half the year? And he's still a yo-yo. He's still up and down. I don't know. Franchise tag 1 year, another 1 year prove it type of situation. I'm all for that. Because this Bears team has cap room to be able to afford to make Alshon Jeffrey a franchise tag player. And that's what that franchise tag is there for in this particular case. And it would be ridiculous for this organization to not utilize it here. In terms of Matt Forte, he's had a lot of good years in Chicago, but maybe it is the end of the road. If he's willing to come back for another year or two, but come back for another year or two at role player back money, but really good role player back money, lower tier starter money, then I'm okay with that. But if he's going to want another big payday, I'm just not willing, if I'm the Bears organization, to give it to him at this point in time, because there's no reason, because you have other backs behind him like Jeremy Langford, Kadeem Carey, and you can go into the draft and get another one. The Bears have more leverage here with Matt Forte than Matt Forte does with the Bears. If Matt Forte goes, the Bears aren't going to miss him that much, but it would be nice to have him. But Matt Forte, if he doesn't resign with the Chicago Bears, is probably going to be struggling to look for a job. He might eventually find one, but he might not get the money that he thought he was going to on the market. And we'll see what happens with him. But another important contract decision I think the Bears have that isn't talked about is they've got to cut Jermon Bushrod. Time to let him go because he wasn't even starting at left tackle the majority of the year. That was Charles Leno. They got to figure out what they're going to do with Martellus Bennett. I think there's a very good chance he could be a cap casualty as well. We'll see what happens there. But then also you look at Kyle Long too. He's played 3 years in the league now, and based off of the structure of rookie deals, the Bears will soon have to make a decision on whether or not they're going to pick up his 5th-year option. As of time of this recording, I don't remember seeing an announcement officially yet because I don't think the new league year hasn't started yet to where they picked up his 5th-year option. But when it does, I would anticipate they'll pick up his 5th-year option, but it might be wise to go ahead and just lock him up to a long-term extension because, if anything, the experiment with him playing at right tackle this past year would maybe drop his value just a little bit because he was playing as an average right tackle as opposed to a Pro Bowl caliber right guard. Now, you're looking at Kyle Long. This is the other issue with him. He's already going to be 28 years of age. Do you want to wait another year or two before you give him a long-term deal where you're doing it when he's 30 years old? No. To me, I'd rather see them give him a 4 or 5 year long-term deal when he's age 28, so that way you could still see him play throughout the entirety of that deal, and it doesn't look like a salary cap albatross, and you're not just looking 2 years down the road to have to cut his ass anyways. So I think that's an underrated situation to watch for this Bears organization during this offseason is what they do with Kyle Long, because if you can, I would try to lock him up to a long-term deal now. Now, in terms of the other major organizational priority for this team, I think they're going to have some cap space. So there's going to be a temptation there to want to dive deeper into free agency, and that's a mistake. They could dive into free agency, and they're going to need to. Because when you look at this team, I want you to think back to the drafts between 2007, we'll go 2006 to 2011. 2006 to 2011. The only 2 players that came as a result of those 6 drafts that are still left on this roster are Matt Forte, who's a free agent and 30 years old, and Jay Cutler, who came as a result of trading the 2009 and 2010 first-round picks. Remember when this team drafted Greg Olsen a couple of years later because of Mike Martz, they traded his ass off to the Carolina Panthers. Oh, that was a good one. They have nobody left from the 06, 07 drafts, nobody from the 09 drafts, so the 2010 drafts, 2011. Nobody left except Jay Cutler, who's in his mid-30s almost, and Matt Forte, who's a 30-year-old running back who was part of the 2008 draft class. So the point I'm getting at here is to replenish the lack of depth in the organization and star power and quality of players because of that gaping void from 2006 to 2011 in terms of what those drafts produced for this roster, because there should still be key contributors from those drafts on this team, and there just isn't. Now you have to sit there and you do have to occasionally plug in some holes and fill some voids in free agency, but not necessarily going out there and spending like crazy. Now, maybe one guy you would explore the thought of spending crazy on might be Muhammad Wilkerson of the Jets. He had a contract year this year and he played like a monster, but he's been a really, really good 3-4 defensive lineman for the past several years. Now, chances are, I would think that the Jets might end up franchising him, which will probably cool the Bears off, obviously. But if they don't, if you're going to spend big money on a guy, I'm okay with spending big money on a 26-year-old Muhammad Wilkerson who's put up several really good years and was a monster this past year. But otherwise, in terms of free agency, I would expect him to look mainly on the defensive side of the ball to plug in some holes, in particular in the front 7 of that defense. I've looked to the Denver Broncos, Danny Trevathan. The Bears' #1 need defensively, I think everybody agrees, is inside linebacker. Trevathan is known to John Fox. He played in the 3-4 this past year in Denver, and he's played relatively well. Again, a 25-year-old guy. You're not going to have to break the bank to sign him. This might be a similar signing to a Pernell McPhee this past offseason. Danny Trevathan, to me, I think will be a very, very high priority and a top target for the Bears this offseason. And then I look at maybe another player from the Broncos, Malik Jackson. He's probably going to be a guy. He had a good year. I think it's going to be one of these things where his value is going to be a little bit higher in terms of contract than what it actually should be. But again, when you're the Bears, you can afford to do that with occasional guys, overpay them just a little bit because of the schematic fit. And again, familiarity with John Fox, a young guy, 26 years of age, and a perfect fit for the defensive end in a 3-4 system. Those are the type of guys that I expect them to target. Maybe they'd go crazy after Muhammad Wilkerson if he's not franchised. And it would be hard for me to knock that because you need some type of impact player on that front, and Muhammad Wilkerson could potentially definitely be that. He would be a little bit of a game changer for that defensive front 7 of the Bears. But I look at guys, especially Danny Trevathan and Malik Jackson, those could be solid guys that you don't have to break the bank for, that don't bury you in a salary cap sense for years, and could help turn the Bears into an even better defensive unit in 2016, especially when you anticipate what the Bears are probably going to do in the 2016 NFL Draft. Now, what are their biggest needs? To me, first and foremost, it's still quarterback. It's been the need for years, no matter how much anybody tries to deny. Quarterback is the #1 need of this organization because until they get a young franchise quarterback that they can build around, they are just wasting time with Jay Cutler, and they are just wasting time as an organization because they're going to continue to fool themselves into thinking they're closer than they really are and better than they really are. In order to complete a full and necessary complete top-down, bottom-up rebuild, you must find that young franchise quarterback. This is not up for negotiation. This is the #1 need for the Chicago Bears organization, short-term and long-term, because even short-term, if you draft a guy and he doesn't play that first year, but you kept Cutler for 2016, maybe Cutler really responds, has his best year as a Chicago Bear, because he's worried about this asshole that's 21, 22, 23 years of age taking his damn job. Putting some urgency in him. Because that's the one thing Cutler's never really had is any urgency in terms of losing his job. It's always been something we defend the guy, and even when he's hurt and the other guy plays well, Cutler's going to get the job right back. There's no question about it. So he doesn't have to improve. He doesn't have to get a whole lot better. He can stay in the comfort zone. You don't want that quarterback in the comfort zone when that comfort zone hasn't been merited or earned. So quarterback, the Bears sitting at pick 11. They might have a chance at a guy like Carson Wentz or Paxton Lynch. I'd probably definitely prefer Carson Wentz. But it would take balls and take guts to take a guy like that at number 11. Maybe you're able to trade down, but maybe you're not. We've got a long ways to go before the draft. But if you're looking at somebody maybe day 2 that this organization would draft, they say they want to sit him for a year or two behind Cutler, a guy like Jacoby Brissett from North Carolina State would make quite a bit of sense to me. Christian Hackenberg, go fuck yourself, if any of you will say that. Later round, if they wait until late to address quarterback, which is a possibility with this organization. I look at somebody like a Jake Coker from Alabama. He just quarterbacked the Crimson Tide to a national title. He's a guy with championship experience. He's a guy with tools, though. He's got size. He's got some arm strength. Those are the type of prospects you want to gamble on late in the draft. So maybe that's a guy that, worst case scenario, develops into a long-term quality backup at the NFL level. But most of the rest of the big needs are on the defensive side of the ball. Now, offensive tackle is a need, but it's a matter of what you think of Charles Leno and Kyle long-term as your bookend tackles. Maybe that's something you try to address that with some depth in the middle of the draft. I don't know if that needs to be a high priority in the first 2 to 3 rounds of this draft. But if a guy that's too good to pass up on, maybe they'll explore that option. But they've got to focus on the back end of that defense, the linebacking core and the secondary, in particular the linebacking core. You got to look at the inside linebackers. That's the single biggest weakness on this Bears organization, in particular this Bears defense. I think everybody agrees with that. Shea McClellan's a free agent. He didn't really show me much that merits him coming back. And Christian Jones is okay, but he's an average starter at best. They need one impact inside linebacker for sure, and they probably could use 2 starters to come out of this draft. Now, the Bears sitting at number 11, at one point in time, I thought they were going to miss out on both Jaylon Smith and Myles Jack. And as a result, they'd either have to reach for somebody like Reggie Ragland or Darren Lee, or they'd have to look at the position a little bit later in the draft. But with Jaylon Smith's knee injury now, him being there at number 11 is a very realistic possibility. The problem for the Bears organization is that Jaylon Smith would, in theory, represent tremendous value with that 11th overall pick. And he would be a guy that could be a nice long-term answer at the inside linebacker position in 3-4. Problem is, though, do you want to go into a second straight draft basically redshirting a guy, like you had to do with Kevin White in 2015. Now, if you're looking at this from a long-term aspect and you think that Jaylon Smith is clearly the best player on the board and his medicals look like they check out, then you might have to do it and be damned with the consequences and hope you do what you did in 2015 and 2016 and hit on some other picks throughout the draft that compensates for that while you're redshirting that guy and wait for him to play in 2017. If this team took Jaylon Smith at number 11, I wouldn't be too mad at him. If Carson Wentz was on the board, I would prefer Carson Wentz because if I'm going to redshirt a guy for a year, I'd want to redshirt a guy for a year at the quarterback position with those tools that has that type of potential. But that's just me. But Jaylon Smith would make sense. Reggie Ragland, like I said, I think it would be too high for him at number 11. But guys later on in the draft, especially in day 2, I think they could get a really good inside linebacker for their system. Antonio Morrison from Florida. I love the aggressiveness that he plays with. And speaking of a guy that came back like a monster from he had torn his ACL, and I think Adrian Peterson would be proud of his recovery. Or you got somebody like Tyler Matakevich from Temple.
Another guy that, to me, a grinder type of guy, but you'd be surprised about the number of plays that he makes. Reminds me somewhat of Chris Borland coming out of Wisconsin. This is a guy you take in round 3, you plug him inside, and he might be an 8 to 10 year starter for you. They could use some athleticism and quickness and depth on the edge as well. Lamar Houston played better in the second half of the season, but in 2 years he's had one half of a good season. Pernell McPhee obviously was a really quality signing. Willie Young, when they finally decided to deploy him in the 3-4, he showed some potential, even if it isn't the best schematic fit. But they could still use some depth at edge rusher. Guys like maybe Leonard Floyd, but again, I think pick 11 might be a little rich for him. Maybe in round 2, you're looking at guys like Noah Spence and Shalik Calhoun, maybe Jordan Jenkins from Georgia, maybe Scooby Wright from Arizona. Cornerback is a position that could be addressed early. The secondary in general could be addressed early. And sitting at pick 11, there's a chance that guys like Vernon Hargraves, Jalen Ramsey, Mackenzie Alexander, Eli Apple, any of those guys could potentially be there for the Bears, and it might be tempting for them to take one of those guys because while Kyle Fuller got better as 2015 went along, they still have a need for depth and talent in the defensive backfield. So I look at this Bears team,
2015 wasn't a total unmitigated disaster, although I wish it would have ended up with a top 3 pick. But it is what it is. They showed some growth. They showed some improvement. Some players developed and got better. Some did not. But the real work of the rebuilding process has only begun for this Bears organization, so it'll be interesting to see what their philosophy and approach is this offseason.